Hey, good morning, everybody, and welcome to the Talent and Strategy Show here on the Success is a Choice Podcasting Network. I'm your host, Jamy Bechler, and with us, as always, is our co-host, Ruston Pierce. Good morning to you, Ruston.
Good morning.
Good morning, and our very, very special guest this morning is Melissa Agnes. Some of you may be familiar with her, as she's been on the Success is a Choice podcast before a few years ago, so we're having her back. But Melissa is the founder and CEO of the Crisis Ready Institute. She's also written a book. She is one of the world's foremost experts on being ready for crisis. So, Melissa, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. Happy to be here.
Awesome. Your episode when you were on the Success is a Choice podcast before is still one of my favorite. You had a lot of great insights. And so if people aren't familiar with that or they want to go back and check that out, jamybechler.com/Melissa Agnes. So jamybechler.com/Melissa Agnes, and you can go check that out. But we appreciate you joining us today. As always, this show is made possible by our friends over at Affinity Recruiting and Consulting. Check them out at affinitytoday.com. So Melissa, for those people out there that maybe haven't heard of you or seen the episode before that you were on, give us kind of a 30,000-foot view of who Melissa Agnes is.
Professionally, so I specialize in crisis communication, crisis leadership. I won't go over the whole spiel, but I think that the biggest thing that is consistent in my world and my career is frustration at the world in being what we call crisis ready. And so in 2020, my book came out in 2018. I realized through readership that there was something very fundamentally different about my methodology and my ideology, or I should say the methodology and ideology of Crisis Ready, because now that's its own brand. And I spent a few months figuring out why, and then a couple of years figuring out how do I actually take this and bring it to the world and scale it in a way, because it's not okay that it's special or unique. There's nothing like it shouldn't be, right? It just seems like the right thing to do. And we aren't equipped. We aren't taught in school in any way, shape, or form, in any grade or any aspect of education on how to lead and communicate effectively through crisis. So there's a massive void, there's a massive gap, and as a result, there's a lot of suffering in the world in so many different ways. And so when I founded Crisis Ready Institute, it was how do we teach that skill set? How do we provide professionals both in organizations and consultants, and of course students, because those are our leaders of tomorrow, with this skill set that we aren't equipped with, that nobody introduces or teaches or prepares us with, so that we can hopefully do better in the future.
So you said it's kind of your unique brand or something that people aren't doing. What's kind of the difference between what you're doing in your thought process on crisis readiness compared to maybe the traditional route of crisis preparedness?
From a very basic standpoint, from the foundational standpoint of what that answer was and is, now it's evolving and growing in complexity, was crisis ready is a cultural approach. So crisis ready is a term that I coined 12 years ago at this point, and it was because I was frustrated with the status quo of crisis preparedness, which is the traditional kind of vernacular for what we do, being crisis prepared. And what that means is to have a plan. So I'll always use the term a crisis ready program that gets ingrained into the culture of an organization. That's crisis ready. Crisis preparedness is having a plan that leadership says, hey, we need this thing called a crisis management plan or a crisis comms plan. Let's do it and let's file it away. And anybody, jumping back to COVID, anybody who had invested in that plan pre-COVID quickly learned during COVID that it did nothing to serve them. And this is, crisis ready exists way before COVID. And our approach has always been, how do we teach the mindset, the skill set, and structure the organizations to have the capabilities to support that mindset and skill set, so that you have a program that's ingrained into the culture, enabling an entire organization in every single department to be able to identify, categorize, and respond to risk in a way that actually creates opportunity. So it creates opportunity for trust building, for just relationship strengthening, and strengthening of the brand equity when change, challenge, and crisis occurs. So it's very much kind of an ideology. It's very much an approach on creating that culture versus just checking off a box and having a stagnant plan that does absolutely nothing to serve you.
So Melissa, yeah. So Melissa, when you think through groups that you all have worked with, can you give us some examples of tangible ways that you all have helped avert crisis?
I mean, the biggest example, or not the biggest, but my favorite example that comes to mind is, and I'm sure that we talked about this, Jamy, on the first episode, which was issue versus crisis. I can put money down. I don't remember, but I'll put money down that definition is there. Because it's so fundamental. So it's something that we do a lot. We teach leaders, we teach teams to identify the difference between an issue and a crisis, or non-issue, issue, and crisis, so that you can actually respond effectively, getting ahead of it in real time versus being reactive, right? And being behind all the time, playing catch up.
Sure.
So I remember one of my, I have a lot of favorite clients, but one of my favorite clients called me at some point because they had an incident on their grounds where there were over 100,000 people, and they thought it was not true, but in the moment they thought that they had an active shooter situation, and they were tweeting. That was the best that they could think of doing in the moment, which does nothing to actually support and serve and protect people on the ground, right? So they called me afterwards, and I remember leaving that conversation and feeling really badly, because I was like, they didn't get the Melissa Agnes experience, because they said, we need some training. And I went into how they don't need training, not yet. They need a whole lot before they need the training, and the severity of the situation, and the responsibility, and the accountability, and like all the things that I feel deeply about in terms of getting them to be crisis ready, and the significance of it due to their, they have, over the span of about 3 weeks, they've got over 2 million people on their grounds, right? So that's a big responsibility, especially in this day and age. And so anyways, fast forward. So we started working together. We put together their program. We trained their teams, et cetera, et cetera. Part of that is learning the difference between issue and crisis, and defining the thresholds within the organization that makes an issue into a crisis, and vice versa. And then, so we have this organization that did not know how to respond to risk at all. Flash forward to like 3 years later, my main contact within the company, she calls and she says, Melissa, your whole definition around issue and crisis, it's not correct. So I sat there and I said, okay, tell me what happened. Tell me why you're saying it. And it turned out that they had an incident on their grounds that was absolutely a crisis, but because the team was able to come together so quickly, so seamlessly, so efficiently and effectively, and with such like intrinsic skill, that they just, without even realizing what they were doing, they took a crisis, immediately de-escalated that down to an issue, and then from there, a non-issue, and then called me to tell me that my methodology was wrong. So that to me is just a really, really wonderful example of, in my opinion, of like where you can go on that spectrum of understanding and learning and skill, and working together as a team to save lives, to save brand, to save people, to save environment, whatever types of crisis your organization is prone to.
Well, I've heard you talk about kind of a response, a crisis response penalty, or there's a penalty for how the response is. Can you elaborate on that and talk a little bit about what that penalty is, and why, what are the negative consequences to these crises?
So a crisis response penalty, the CRP, it's a term that I coined when I was writing the book. I was trying to kind of put quantifiers to ineffective response. So crisis management requires actions and communication to both be really, really strong and happen simultaneously in the right time frame. So that's kind of like, that encompasses a lot, but within that, but that's the actions to actually fix the situation or right the wrong or correct whatever it is you have to do to manage the actual incident, and then communicating effectively. The communication piece is the most challenging aspect of it, all within the right timeline. Crisis occurs, so I'm going to pretend this is a timeline right here. I think this is going the right way for you guys. Crisis occurs, and crisis comes with consequences. By nature, right? Otherwise, it wouldn't be a crisis. The longer you take to effectively respond, so action and communication to happen simultaneously in the right time frame, the longer you take, the more trust you destroy, ownership of the narrative you lose, and which is harder and harder to get back, and it's broken trust, and material impact you suffer. So the crisis response penalty, the CRP, is the piece within crisis management or crisis ready that you actually have, let's say 99.9% control over mitigating. If you respond to an incident or a crisis right effectively, action and communication, right timeline, right from the get-go, you're going to mitigate all of that crisis response penalty. And to give you an example that I really love to use is, this goes way back, but the Dr. Dow and United Airlines incident, do you guys remember that? Pretty sure it was like 2018, so it's been a while. But there was, so United Airlines had a fully booked plane. People were on board. And back then it was customary for deadheaders. So a deadheader is a airline employee who needs to get on board this airline in order to get to its destination to actually work on whatever plane is over there, right? So they're deadheaders. It was customary back then that if there were no available seats on a flight, that you would just remove a paying customer from the flight and give it to the deadheader. So on this flight back then, there were four, if I'm not mistaken, there were 4 deadheaders needing to get onto this flight. They asked people to volunteer. Nobody volunteered to give up their seats and take the next flight and get a voucher and all the things. And so they randomly selected 4 people to do that. Dr. Dow was one of those 4 people. And Dr. Dow refused to get off the plane. He had paid for his seat, he had paid for the flight, and he had patients that he as well needed to get to. Human factor risk is a risk for every organization, like it or not, right? It just is. And things escalated so quickly in that situation. Everybody had a camera on them. And there was viral footage that went instantaneously viral of Dr. Dow with a very bloody face, crooked glasses, being physically dragged on his back out of the plane and then delirious and disoriented, and just a really, really horrific scene. The reason I say this is because human factor risk is always a risk. And so crisis happens. It's going to you have somebody who was mistreated is a understatement, right? Of how to explain that went instantaneously viral. You have customers around the world going, oh my goodness, United Airlines, like, how could you treat paying anybody like this, right? And then so instant like boycotts and all the things. It took United Airlines 48 hours to respond effectively. 48 hours, they responded 3 times within the 48 hours. So when I say effectively, I mean effectively. They put out 2 apologies that said things like, we apologize for having inconvenienced passengers, which was entirely tone deaf. And then they put out 1 internal memo that was from Oscar Munoz, the CEO, to his entire team saying, we stand by the decisions made by our employees on that flight. And that, of course, got leaked. So that was the 3rd communication, again, completely tone deaf. 48 hours. Within the span of that 48 hours, their market cap dropped by $1.4 billion. So you want to like quantify that. That's a $700 million a day mistake. Then people say to me, so after the end of the 48 hours, they actually got their act together, probably hired the right people and issued an effective response and went on a whole like kind of campaign apology and did what they should have done back over here before the 48 hours. And their market cap started to go back up. So people often say, like, if it doesn't have long-term impact, the material impact, then who cares, right? If it's going to go back anyways, go back up anyways. My response to that is a couple things, but one is, why would you want to go through that in the first place? Why would you want to upset people, your stakeholders, so so drastically that your market cap drops to that point. And then looking at the crisis response penalty, because they could have avoided that 100%. Had they done the initial response that calmed everything down at the beginning, that wouldn't have happened. What I love about this example is that it wasn't just a monetary impact, a crisis ready response penalty. So there was a personal consequence to Oscar Munoz himself. So his employment agreement got amended so that he will no longer become the chairman of United. So there was a personal consequence to him. And more, I'll say this, more and more, we are seeing executives and board members being held accountable for lack of crisis readiness. Because in this world, so much is predictable. People are avoiding it. People are dying as a result of that. As a severe example, right? There's other impacts, but that's the most severe, in my opinion. So that happened to him. The market cap dropped, and the industry as a whole changed legislation that said that commercial airlines are no longer allowed to remove paying customers for deadheaders. So the CRP of that was personal, was financial, and was industry-wide. And it could have 100% been avoided had they been crisis ready for a risk that you can't always control. You can't prevent everything, but you can be prepared. You can be ready for anything. That was long-winded.
So, no, that's great. So let's say you get called and a crisis has literally just happened. It's fresh. It's, within minutes of taking place. What are your next steps? What are you going to do to help manage that crisis? What are your practical steps look like at that point?
So my personal area of expertise is in the comms and the leadership standpoint of it. So that aspect of the action and communication. And then we bring team members in that are really phenomenal at emergency management and crisis management action side of things. If it's an organization that I've never worked with before, which is always the most challenging.
Sure.
Is the first thing that you want to do is understand as much as you can of not just what went wrong, and hear from the comms and leadership standpoint. One of the things I talked about that we aren't equipped with, nobody teaches us these things. It's not just about what went wrong and how do we stop the bleeding from a financial or an operational standpoint. It's looking at what are the emotions involved with this? Why are the emotions that are involved with this? How are people feeling? Why are people feeling? How do we lead with EQ? And there's a lot that goes into that, so that one of the crisis ready rules is you cannot beat emotion with logic. Yeah. So crisis by nature is a very emotionally impactful, emotionally triggering situation, no matter what the crisis is. It's triggering for you, triggering for your team, and then of course it's triggering for anybody who's directly or indirectly involved or impacted. If you can't beat emotion with logic, and yet it's super emotional, and you want to come at it with to kind of override those emotions with, let's say, directives, or you want to lead people to safety or whatever the case is, you can't do that you can't do that effectively the way that you would in a regular day-to-day kind of business setting or just any kind of setting, unless you speak to that emotion first. And from a comm standpoint and a leadership standpoint, that is one of the most challenging things to do, because emotion is vulnerable, right? Emotion. So, and communicating in that time is one of the most uncomfortable, intimidating, vulnerable, scary, all of the above things to actually have to sit in. You have upset people for whatever reason. You want to speak to that upset and lead them through in a right way. You may have backlash. You may have you have your own emotions. You may feel guilt about things, like whatever the context of the situation entails. You have to sit in that space and communicate. It's easy to say, let's go fix it. Let's go do this. It's another thing to sit there and go, here's what happened. Here's where we may have screwed up. Here's what we need to do next. We feel, or we relate to how you're feeling. Like, that is really, really uncomfortable for human beings, period. Plus, we aren't equipped with that skill. So when I said earlier to kind of stop talking and answer your question more directly, not having worked with an organization that's in crisis is really challenging, because I haven't built that rapport with them. I haven't built that relationship, and I haven't helped them start to understand their own what I call the 5 hindrances of crisis ready that hinder your ability to rise to that discomfort that we aren't trained or, pre-equipped to actually feel a little bit less vulnerable in. Does that make sense?
Oh yeah.
That's like one aspect. There's a lot, but that would be one of the first things that I'm assessing.
I think so. In a previous organization that I ran, we had to deal with a minor crisis. It was a death of a student in a car wreck, and it had multiple tentacles. It affected every level of our school. His mother was a staff member, so it literally touched every part of our school. I would say probably the most difficult part was just the immediate emotion it created across the entire spectrum of the organization, and trying to deal with a wide range of people who are all feeling it in a very different way. That initial step was extremely hard. So I could see coming into it blind, if you didn't know anything at all about the organization, coming into a very emotionally charged moment has to be really difficult.
It is, and it's the most difficult because that relationship that I form with clients is so critical to helping them be comfortable to rise to that opportunity.
Yeah.
Because it's really hard to do that. And so as an example, recently, a client, an organization contacted me that they found me online, that I had no prior relationship with them. And they had a situation that was absolutely a crisis, still is a crisis, that started about 3 months ago, and had talked about crisis response penalty. They could have nipped it in the bud 3 months ago, like not crisis, issue down to non-issue like that. But it would have required them to do that scary thing and stand into that space and start communicating and the discomfort, it's so uncomfortable, right? You don't know how people are going to respond. You don't know how they're going to backlash at you. You don't necessarily know what to say or how to say it. And so one of the first questions that I asked them when I initially started speaking with them was, why didn't you communicate? Just walk me through what happened internally to do that, to lead to that. And their honest response was, we were blindsided and we were scared and we didn't know how to do that. And that is that's why Crisis Ready Institute exists. That's why the trainings that we put, we provide exist, because that response is so common. We were scared, and that's for people who are actually able to admit that they're scared of something, right?
Sure.
Because that's a lot of ego that you have to kind of overcome to even just say that. We were blindsided, we were scared, we didn't know what to do. And as a result, we are in hell right now.
Yeah.
Well, when I work with a lot of coaches, athletic coaches or athletic directors, a lot of times they will ask me a question, a specific question. It might not be a crisis, but to them, it's a big deal. Hey, I've got this parent that's doing this, or I've got this kid, or I've got this whatever, fill in the blank. And what should I do? And oftentimes it reminded me of when you were talking about the plans that people have for crisis preparedness, as opposed to maybe being crisis ready. I think about, my answer is, well, get in a time machine and go back 5 years ago and treat people better, or do different things better. Like, how you do anything is how you do everything. Like, you want an answer right now to a symptom, but the real problem is more deep seated. That sounds like a lot of what you're doing is that, yeah, we can address the issue. And yes, we do have to address the issue, but your overall culture needs to be better. And my guess would be, and this is, I guess, my question, Melissa, but as you work with companies, businesses, or you just see them from afar, do you find that the companies that have a better culture, that are empowering their employees, that are having an ongoing culture of training and development, are probably having less crisis, or at least are more equipped to handle them?
Absolutely. It's not necessarily that things don't happen. It's that they're able to respond and de-escalate them very quickly. And traditional crisis management, like successful crisis management, would say that the goal in crisis management is to de-escalate the situation as quickly as possible and to suffer the least amount of material impact. That's very, very true. With Crisis Ready, our goal are those two things, as well as, and kind of that shining beacon, is to come out of it with strength and trust and relationships, because business operates on relationships. Everything in life operates on relationships. crisis management essentially is about doing right by the people your organization is designed to serve in the first place. Without those people, and I'm not just talking customers, I'm talking employees, I'm talking investors, I'm talking all the different types of stakeholders. Without those people, your business would cease to operate. So do right by them, and everything else will fall into place. And doing right by them in a hard situation is when you're tested, and is a very, very challenging thing to do because of human nature, because of vulnerability, because of all the things that we've already talked about. But one of the crisis ready rules is people above process and bottom line always. And when you do that, a lot of organizations, I think businesses, just kind of historically speaking, they were taught, again, we aren't equipped. They were taught to look at, how do we stop the bleeding for our operations? How do we fix the bleeding on our revenue, right? Or our bottom line, versus how do we look at the people and what they're feeling and what we could do and what we need to do and how we do right by them in whatever way that needs to take shape, so that our operations continue, so that our bottom line actually increases versus decreases.
So if I was running an organization, how could I be proactive as an employer to identify areas that I need to be paying attention to try to be crisis ready? So, do you see that there's a connection to, it's typically mostly HR related or it's product related? Are there certain areas that I should be paying attention to try to be proactively ready?
The first place I would look, because every company is very different, every organization, I won't say company, every organization is very different. The first place that I would look is, in order to embed a crisis ready culture, it encompasses three things. It's mindset, it's skill set, and then it's capability. So mindset, the way that we choose to see any type of negative situation, the way that we see it directly impacts the actions that we take, which directly impacts the results, right? If we see it as an annoyance or as something that we need to cover up or something we want to avoid, we're going to take a set of actions. If we see it as an opportunity to build brand relationships and just really great things, we're going to take a very different course of action. So mindset, and then skill set is making sure that your entire team knows what to do and how to do. And then capabilities are things like your governance structure and your processes and your procedures that enable all of that to work seamlessly. So where I would start is the mindset. And that is actually actionable. You can look at the organization and go back to the start of 2020 is a great way to do this. We have this opportunity right now. Go back to the start of 2020 and just look at from then until now. So it's not just then, because it's 3 years later and hopefully you've evolved. Look at what is the mindset in HR, like whenever an issue presents itself, so not necessarily a crisis, but an issue presents itself, or an annoyance or a hiccup, or however you want to frame that, what is the mindset and approach that the organization takes, and how is that led? What does leadership do in order, because an organization is led top down and supported bottom up. So how does that look? And you'll find really great areas of strength that you can amplify. And then you'll find a lot of gaps that you can look at. Okay, well, how do we fix this? And that will lead you down a chain reaction of how do you get more crisis ready, depending on where you currently sit on that spectrum.
Well, you do a lot of work with police association, mainly you sit on the board, or you're on a committee of the International Association of Chiefs of Police, but you do a lot of work with police, and they're known to have crises once in a while. They have issues that come up.
Crisis. Yeah.
Constantly.
The industry.
Yes. Do you have any stories? I know you mentioned one story when you were on our podcast before. I'm sure you have a lot of stories, but do you have stories from the world of policing and maybe how they handle some of the state of crisis that they always seem to be in?
So I would say that the major crisis within that profession, within that industry, is the crisis of trust, right? Trust between police agency and community that across the nation is broken. And that, to your point earlier, I think it was Ruston, where that happens over time, right?
Sure.
Now it's also, that's kind of, let's just talk about this country. It's a nationwide crisis. It's also very different from community to community. So depending on the community and depending on both the community and different aspects of the community and the mindset of the agency within those communities, you can have communities that have the strongest relationships of trust and credibility and with their law enforcement agency. So it really depends on a bunch of different criteria. But I would say that it goes back to that space, and I'm simplifying everything right now, let me just say that. But if I were to pick one thing to focus on, talking about trust, law enforcement is a brilliant example of stoic leadership. So what I mean by that is when I talk about we aren't equipped, it's kind of everything that we need to have to have the skills of crisis ready from a comms and a leadership standpoint is counterintuitive to what we are historically taught. So when we look at company, when we look at leadership or a leader, we think of a very stoic, assured, usually male, usually older male, that will get no wrong, there's no place for emotion in leadership or in corporate. And that's all BS. That is all backwards, because when we're talking about relationships and people, which the common denominator across every single industry is human beings. It's run by human beings. And even if you cater to animals, you're still selling to the people who are going to purchase for those animals, right? The relationship is still with human beings. And so to say that there's no place for emotion is backwards, because in a crisis, again, highly emotional state, you need to be able to relate to that emotion and speak to that emotion in order to allow. So the way that I kind of see it is logic gets overridden by emotion when you're highly emotional. That's how human beings are wired. We're emotional beings, whether we'd like to admit it or not, no matter how cerebral of an individual you may be. So visually, with the way that I see that is, in times of crisis, you need to be able to think logically, but your heart is up here and it's clouding that left side of the brain. So in order to, as a leader, to communicate, in order to get through that cloud, to actually lead and resonate, you have to go in through the heart. You have to have high EQ. You have to validate the emotion, which doesn't mean you have to agree with it, but you have to give space for people to feel heard and seen in that emotion. And then you need to relate to that emotion, and then you can come in with the logic. When you look at trust, and I'm not picking on law enforcement here, to your point, I have a lot of experience in this profession, and historically speaking, it's very actionable, right? Emergency management, they're trained tactically to do the action side of crisis management and emergency management. That is their job. They were never taught or trained to focus also on the communication component. And so we have a big culture in that profession, and not just that profession, but we're talking about it in that profession that sees it that way. And that is, again, it's very vulnerable to be vulnerable, or you shouldn't define something with its same term, but it's very uncomfortable to be vulnerable. And when you're talking about saving lives or trust issues or responding to a situation that is highly emotional, it is so uncomfortable, and they were never equipped with it. So I'm oversimplifying it. I'm right now in my world, in my life, if I get mad at everybody, I will be angry all the time. So what I'm doing, and you can maybe hear it, is I'm choosing not to be angry with people. I'm choosing to be angry with the system and saying that it's nobody's fault. Now, it doesn't mean that they shouldn't hold themselves accountable or shouldn't be held accountable, but they weren't equipped in general. In our society, weren't equipped with this, so we need to fix the system to equip people with this. Does that make sense? It's my way of not being angry at every person, at every ineffective leader. But yeah, so I don't know if I answered that question, I'm oversimplifying, but there's a lot that is within law enforcement, within that culture, within that nationwide crisis. Again, there's some chiefs that are the best, the strongest, the most incredible leaders that I've ever had the opportunity or the privilege of working with and even calling friends. And then there's others that just literally say, I don't believe in communication, which I sit there and go like, how are your interpersonal relationships? I don't understand what that means. But there's both of those mindsets within that same. So there's a lot of like battle and not battle isn't the right word, but a lot of kind of conflicting viewpoints. And we're leaning towards, we're headed more towards the trust and the communication and doing the right things with regards to those things. But there's still a lot of internal, I feel like I'm rambling at this point.
I think
it's complex.
It is. It's extremely complex. And, you know, you've said a couple of times you're oversimplifying. And that made me think of another question. You know, but it is complex because you do have such a wide range of emotions involved and so many different personalities and so many different audiences. So I'm just curious, when you talk about being crisis ready, like what does that timeline look like? How long typically does it take you when you're dealing with an organization or a company for them to feel like they are fully crisis ready? Like from start to finish, when you're working with a group, what's the typical timeline for that?
I wanted to say forever for the rest of your life, which is a commitment for that. But no, realistically, you're looking at a couple years, at least a couple years to get you to a point where you're where my client was, where you come back and say, Melissa, your methodology is wrong, which please do. And then it's a forever thing because the company evolves, the times change. And as times change, and it's not just about technology, it's about, you know, the Me Too movement, Black Lives Matter movement, like the way that our society is changing. If you don't get on board with that and understand it in a deeper context, you will be met with even more crises or new crises, right? So it's a commitment to getting the foundation there and then committing to everything that's required to continuously evolve it for the company or for the organization with the times. This
might be a loaded question, but I mean, even the employees change. So, you know, over time, as people have turnover and as organizations change, do you feel like once you've worked with someone that they typically can continue that communication when they do have turnover, or do a lot of them have to bring you back to retrain when they have, you know, significant turnover?
So definitely retraining. One of the things, typically my relationship with clients is very, very long-term. Because even if you're crisis ready, again, times change, things change. You want to up level, you want to upskill. And also it's really great to have somebody like me in your back pocket to say, hey, this is going on. Can I just hop on a quick call? I do that all day, every day, 7 days a week in every time zone. No, but seriously, and it's just these quick calls of like, okay, let's look at this. Let's get ahead of this. Or let's understand the deeper context of this so that you're not calling me in 3 weeks with an actual crisis, right? And it's little things, but when you have the mindset of knowing that you want to get ahead of something, it becomes more frequent and more becomes easier to identify and then to nip in the bud because you've identified it, which is why I'm so adamant with issue versus crisis and being able to do that as like a fundamental component. The other piece of it is what I love doing right now is gamifying and scaling learnings. So people see crisis management. So there's 5 hindrances of crisis ready. This is like new material that I'm developing, but it's the hindrances that prohibit or hinder you from actually becoming crisis ready, no matter where you might sit. So avoidance, ego, fear, ignorance, and politics. All of that is human nature. All of that is something that we battle within ourselves all the time, right? Ego is this incredible force for motivation and propelling us forward. But when ego gets in and wants to protect us and puts a blockage on our ability to be vulnerable and connect emotionally because it's trying to protect us, the identity, the self, then that becomes a hindrance to you being able to lead through crisis. And that's true for all of us because we're human, right?
Yeah.
So one of the things that I love doing right now is saying if crisis ready needs to be cultural, which it does, and that means that every single member of your team should understand these concepts and you should lead with them and it should be ingrained in the culture and all these different things. I don't want it to be a negative thing. You want to avoid, human nature wants, talking about the hindrances, human nature wants to avoid the negative. And of course we do. So how do we flip it and see it as a positive and then invest in it? And to me, creating experiential learning through gamification that then is scaled to really answer your question, Ruston, scaled throughout the organization, and you can put, on new members of teams as you onboard them through these trainings and develop them and get analytics behind them and just all these things. It makes it more immersive, it makes it more fun, it makes it more memorable, and it makes it scalable so that you're not always going back to me, for example, every time. And I have fun doing that. I really do.
Well, we'd like to finish up with parting thoughts. So we'll start with Ruston to kind of give us some thoughts about things he liked about what you said, or other things that he would like to opine on related to the topic. And then we'll finish up with you, Melissa, kind of putting a bow on everything and giving our audience some takeaways.
I think I'll say the exact same thing I said last week. And Melissa, you may not be aware of this, but we actually had a crisis management specialist on last week. And who with the events in Nashville this week, who would have ever imagined that last week and this week's shows would be so practical? But I made the comment last week, and for all of our listeners, I hope you hear this. I've run a lot of organizations. I used to tell our board all the time, we have to have crisis plans in place because it's our insurance policy for our organization. And we insure our buildings, we insure all kinds of things. We have to have an insurance plan for our revenue stream. And the only way that you can ensure that is by being proactive about crisis management, about crisis response. What are we going to do when something happens that could potentially significantly hurt our revenue? If we're being reactionary, we're too late. And so, if you're listening to this, I would strongly encourage you to really think through proactively, what is our crisis intervention? What is our crisis management? What is our crisis ready? Because that is how you ensure your revenue stream. And it's the only thing that will. So that would be my takeaway.
Beautifully said. Thank you. Is it my turn?
Sure.
Yes.
Yeah. Like, Jamy, are you going to go?
That's my fault. I was supposed to say, Melissa, what's your takeaway? So I blew that.
Well, no, that's okay. I want to add to that. So what you just said is spot on and it's so important. It's beyond important. It's critical. Now to actually kind of do that, few things, and to kind of summarize a lot of what we've said is our main points: action and communication in the right timeline, right? You have to take the actions within the team to actually fix, remedy, manage what happened or what is happening or what's about to happen. And you have to communicate. If you don't communicate effectively, you will suffer a crisis response penalty needlessly. And that can be dire. That could be the turning point of dire within the crisis. And the communication and the leadership aspect of that, I see those as being very much, they're very much together, is the most challenging aspect of that, because you're dealing with emotion, because you're trying to anticipate, you're getting ahead, you're dealing with getting ahead in terms of like social media and media, getting ahead of other people's narratives and agendas that now can have crisis response penalty on your own and take away from your own and destroy trust and all of these different things. It is the most challenging aspect, and it is the aspect that you can't put on a checklist like the action side of things. You can more easily put on a checklist of like, let's make sure we do this to fix the bleeding, or stop the bleeding. Comms is different. And again, it's not a skill set that we are equipped with at any point in our learning in education, and that's not okay. So investing in your ability, I don't care where you sit within the organization, you are a human. This will serve you as a human in your personal life as well. Invest in a better, or just upping your skill level in that communication aspect in times of critical moments of high intensity, and invest in your teams so that you have a strong communication team, that it's not PR, it's not spin, it's not putting out one response and then it's a one and done. It's looking at the arc of the relationship and the unfolding of the crisis and the remedying of the crisis, and how to create that storyline that connects you with people so that you come out of the situation with even more like stronger trust and as a stronger leader within your industry. So, and that is the piece, that is the scary piece, that is the vulnerable piece, that is the most uncomfortable, intimidating piece. We aren't equipped with it. But now that you know that, it's on you to equip yourself, because there are ways to do that. For example, and this isn't a plug, but for example, that is the mission of Crisis Ready Institute. We are doing that, right? So there are ways to go out there and to actually to remove that ignorance piece of the hindrances, as well as all the other ones, and educate yourself and hone that skill.
Well, awesome. She's Melissa Agnes at crisisreadyinstitute.com. We will put all of her bio in the show notes. It's important to have a crisis plan for a lot of things, but you can't plan for everything. So it's good to have a culture of just readiness. So you definitely want to check out her stuff so that you can maybe get some insights, some additional insights and ideas about how to make your business, your company, maybe just your family, your friend group, more ready for a crisis, and to have a better culture there. If you would, please kindly smash that like button, or just tap it if you don't want to break the screen on your iPhone. Share the show if you would. And until next time, remember that success is a choice. What choice will you make today?